Dr. Helen Carter brushed the red Martian dust from the strange metal surface. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold inside the excavation tunnel, but from excitement. After 3 months of digging, the team had finally reached something that shouldn't exist on Mars. The metal was smooth and covered with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Helen was a language expert. She had spent her whole career studying old languages from Earth, languages that nobody spoke anymore. She had come to Mars expecting to find rocks and maybe some fossils. Instead, she found this massive structure buried deep underground. The symbols on its surface looked familiar somehow, like something she had seen in her old textbooks back on Earth. Commander Jake Morrison stood behind her with his arms crossed. He was the security chief for Colony 7, and he didn't like mysteries. His job was to keep everyone safe, and this strange artifact made him nervous. He had already sent reports back to Earth, but it would take days to get a response. For now, he had to decide what to do with this discovery. Helen ran her fingers across the symbols, tracing their shapes. Her assistant Peter Walsh was taking pictures and making notes. He was young and excited, fresh out of university with big dreams about finding alien civilizations. This discovery was everything he had hoped for and more. The chamber they stood in was enormous, bigger than any building in the colony. The walls were carved from solid rock, but the floor was covered in the same strange metal as the artifact. Lights had been set up around the space, but they barely pushed back the darkness. The artifact itself sat in the center, a tall pillar about 20 feet high and 10 feet wide. Helen pulled out her computer tablet and started comparing the symbols to her database. She had thousands of ancient languages stored in the device, everything from Egyptian hieroglyphs to ancient Chinese. She scrolled through different scripts looking for a match. Nothing seemed to fit at first. The symbols were too complex, too different from anything human. Then she found something. The patterns reminded her of cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing used in ancient Mesopotamia. She pulled up examples of Sumerian texts, one of the oldest written languages on Earth. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to make her heart race. How could an alien artifact on Mars use symbols similar to ancient Sumerian? Peter looked over her shoulder at the screen. He saw what she was seeing and his eyes went wide. This didn't make any sense. Sumerian had been dead for thousands of years, and it had definitely been created by humans on Earth. There was no way aliens should know about it. Morrison wasn't impressed. He wanted the artifact sealed up and studied from a safe distance. But Helen argued that they needed to document everything while they had the chance. She wanted to understand what these symbols meant. Morrison gave her 3 days to study the artifact before he would lock down the chamber. Helen worked without stopping. She barely slept, surviving on coffee and energy bars. Peter helped her photograph every inch of the artifact's surface. They found that the symbols weren't random decorations. They formed patterns, sequences that repeated around the pillar. It looked like instructions or maybe some kind of poem. On the second day, Helen made a breakthrough. She realized that the symbols weren't just similar to Sumerian. They were Sumerian. The grammar was right, the word order matched, even the style felt authentic. Someone or something had used this ancient Earth language on purpose. The question was why. She started translating the text. Most of it was unclear, using words and concepts she didn't recognize. But one section stood out. It seemed to be a command, a phrase that needed to be spoken aloud. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. Was this an activation sequence? Was the artifact some kind of machine waiting to be turned on? Morrison had forbidden anyone from touching the artifact or doing anything that might activate it. But Helen couldn't help herself. The scientist in her needed to know if she was right. She told herself that just speaking the words wouldn't hurt anything. If the artifact had been waiting for thousands of years, surely it was broken by now. Peter tried to stop her, but Helen had already made up her mind. She stood in front of the artifact and read the Sumerian phrase out loud. Her pronunciation was careful, each syllable pronounced exactly as the ancient people of Earth would have said it. The words felt strange in her mouth, heavy with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. For a moment, nothing happened. Peter let out a breath of relief. Maybe the artifact was dead after all. But then the symbols on the surface began to glow brighter. The faint light Helen had noticed before became brilliant, filling the chamber with blue-white radiance. The ground started to shake. Morrison's voice came through the radio, demanding to know what was happening. Alarms were going off throughout the colony. The shaking grew stronger. Helen and Peter backed away from the artifact as its surface began to change. Panels slid apart, revealing complex machinery underneath. The pillar started to unfold, sections extending and rotating like some kind of mechanical flower. Morrison burst through the chamber entrance with 4 security guards. They all carried weapons, though Helen doubted guns would do much good against whatever was happening. The artifact had fully transformed now. It wasn't a pillar anymore. It was a giant mechanical being, standing 30 feet tall with limbs that ended in tools or weapons. Its head was smooth and featureless except for 2 eyes that glowed with the same blue-white light. Everyone in the chamber stood frozen, staring up at the machine. It looked down at them, and Helen felt something touch her mind. It wasn't quite like hearing voices or seeing images. It was more direct than that, like someone was placing thoughts directly into her brain. The machine was trying to communicate. The thoughts came in Sumerian. Helen was the only one who could understand them. The machine was introducing itself, explaining what it was and why it was here. Helen's legs felt weak. She grabbed Peter's arm to steady herself. This was impossible, but it was happening anyway. The machine called itself a Sentinel. It had been built by an ancient race to protect the galaxy from a terrible enemy. It had been sleeping here for over 50,000 years, waiting for someone who could speak the activation language. That someone was Helen. Morrison shouted questions, but Helen couldn't answer yet. She was too overwhelmed by what the Sentinel was telling her. The galaxy was in danger. Something was coming. Something that destroyed entire civilizations. And now that she had woken it up, the Sentinel expected her to help stop it. The next few hours were chaos in Colony 7. Morrison had locked down the entire facility and sent emergency messages to Earth. Helen sat in a conference room with Peter and the colony's director, a stern woman named Linda Hayes. The Sentinel remained in the underground chamber, powered down but still very much active. Helen tried to explain what the Sentinel had told her. The machine's creators called themselves the Architects. They had been an advanced civilization that existed millions of years ago. They had traveled across the galaxy, studying younger races and leaving behind gifts of knowledge. On Earth, they had taught early humans language and writing, specifically Sumerian. The Architects had done this as a backup plan. They were fighting a war against something called the Devourers, a race of creatures that consumed other civilizations. The Architects built Sentinels and hid them on different worlds, programming them to activate only when someone spoke their language. It was a test to make sure the people who found them were descendants of those they had helped. Director Hayes didn't believe any of it. She thought Helen had damaged her mind somehow when she activated the artifact. She wanted to bring in doctors and psychiatrists to examine her. But Morrison had seen the Sentinel move and transform. He knew something real had happened in that chamber. Peter suggested they bring the Sentinel's story to Earth scientists. Let them decide if it was true or not. But the Sentinel had shown Helen images of the Devourers, memories stored in its ancient computer brain. She had seen worlds being torn apart, ships bigger than moons, and creatures that existed to consume and destroy. If even half of what the Sentinel showed her was real, humanity was in serious danger. Morrison made a decision. He would allow Helen to continue communicating with the Sentinel, but under strict supervision. Guards would be present at all times and everything would be recorded. If the Sentinel showed any signs of being dangerous, he would find a way to shut it down, even if that meant burying it under a mountain of rock. Helen returned to the chamber with Peter and 4 armed guards. The Sentinel activated when she entered, its eyes lighting up with recognition. It spoke to her again in Sumerian, and she translated for the others. The machine wanted to show them proof of the Devourers. It had data stored from the war, observations and recordings made by the Architects before they disappeared. The Sentinel projected images directly into the air using some kind of holographic technology. Everyone in the chamber could see them. The pictures showed space battles on a scale that made human wars look like playground fights. Thousands of ships exchanging fire, planets being cracked open like eggs, stars being harvested for fuel. The Devourers were real and they were terrifying. Morrison recorded everything with his tablet computer. This evidence would be enough to convince Earth's government that the threat was serious. The Sentinel explained that the Devourers moved slowly across the galaxy, taking centuries to travel between stars. But they were thorough. Once they arrived in a system, nothing survived. The Sentinel told Helen that there were others like it scattered across space. Each one was hidden on a different world, waiting to be activated. If humans could find them and wake them up, They would have a fighting chance when the Devourers arrived. The Sentinel estimated they had maybe 10 years before the enemy reached human space. Peter asked how the Sentinel knew where the others were hidden. The machine explained that all Sentinels were connected through something it called the Archive Network. Once activated, it could sense the locations of its sleeping brothers, but it couldn't wake them up remotely. Someone would have to travel to each world and speak the activation phrase in person. That someone would be Helen. The Sentinel was very clear about this. It would only respond to her voice, and the other Sentinels would be the same. She carried something in her genetic code, a marker left by the architects thousands of years ago. She was descended from the humans they had taught and guided. That made her special, gave her authority over the Sentinel network. Helen felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was just a language professor. She studied dead civilizations and ancient texts. She wasn't a soldier or an explorer, but the Sentinel didn't care about her doubts. It needed her, and through her, humanity needed the other Sentinels. Director Hayes approved an expedition after seeing the Sentinels' recordings. Messages were sent to Earth requesting ships and supplies. A team would be assembled to search for the other Sentinels. Helen would lead them, with Morrison in charge of security and Peter helping with translation and research. While they waited for approval from Earth, Helen spent every day with the Sentinel. She learned more about the architects and their war. The ancient race had been peaceful explorers originally, traveling the galaxy to study and learn. But the Devourers changed everything. The architects built weapons and trained for war, becoming something they had never wanted to be. In the end, it hadn't been enough. The architects lost the war and disappeared. The Sentinel didn't know what happened to them. Maybe they were all dead, or maybe they had fled to another galaxy. The only things they left behind were the Sentinels and the knowledge they had given to younger races. The Sentinel taught Helen about its weapons and capabilities. It could generate energy shields strong enough to stop nuclear explosions. Its weapons fired concentrated plasma that could cut through starship armor. It could survive in space without any protection, and its power source would last for millions of years. Each Sentinel was designed to be a one-machine army. Earth's response came 3 weeks later. They approved the expedition and assigned a ship called the Horizon to carry the team. Captain Linda Hayes, no relation to the colony director, would command the vessel. She was a decorated officer with experience in deep space exploration and first contact situations. Her crew was the best Earth could provide. The Horizon arrived at Mars 2 months after the Sentinel's activation. It was a beautiful ship, sleek and modern with the latest engines and weapons. Helen felt nervous as she prepared to leave the colony. This mission could take years. She might never see Mars or Earth again, but she didn't have a choice. The Sentinel had shown her what the Devourers would do if they weren't stopped. Every human in the galaxy would die. Morrison and Peter packed their equipment and said goodbye to their colleagues. The Sentinel had to be transported carefully to the Horizon using specialized equipment. It could move on its own, but it was too large to fit through the colony's tunnels without causing damage. Engineers spent a week cutting a new passage wide enough for the machine. Finally, everything was ready. Helen stood on the Horizon's bridge and looked out at Mars through the viewing screen. Captain Linda Hayes gave the order to depart. The ship's engines hummed to life, and they lifted away from the red planet. Their first destination was a frozen moon orbiting a gas giant in the Epsilon Eridani system. According to the Sentinel, another of its kind slept there beneath the ice. 3 months after the war ended, Helen stood on the observation deck of the Horizon and looked out at the stars. The ship was back in Earth orbit, undergoing repairs and resupply. Most of the crew had been given leave to visit their families and recover from the long years of fighting. But Helen couldn't go home. She didn't really have a home anymore. The Sentinels remained active, spread across human space as guardians. They had pledged to protect humanity from any future threats. Admiral Palmer had integrated them into Earth's defense forces, creating a new branch of the military specifically designed to work with the ancient machines. Human soldiers trained alongside Sentinels, learning tactics and strategies from a war that ended millions of years ago. Peter had stayed with Helen, refusing to abandon his friend even though she made him uncomfortable now. She didn't blame him for the discomfort. She knew she was different, spoke differently, moved differently. Sometimes she would stand motionless for hours, lost in the archive network. Other times she would suddenly know things she shouldn't. Information pulled from Sentinel sensors across the galaxy. Morrison had returned to Mars Colony 7, accepting a promotion to oversee the entire colony's security. Before he left, he visited Helen one last time. He told her that she had done something incredible, something that would be remembered for generations. But he also said he hoped she found peace somehow, found a way to be happy despite everything that had happened to her. Captain Hayes gave Helen a permanent position on the horizon. The ship would continue exploring the galaxy, searching for more architect technology and keeping watch for other threats. Hayes understood that Helen needed a purpose, needed something to do with the power she now carried. Sitting idle would drive her insane. The Unified Defense Council wanted Helen to come to Earth for debriefings and ceremonies. They had questions about the architects and the Sentinels, wanted to understand everything she had learned. But Helen kept putting them off. She wasn't ready to face crowds of politicians and generals, all of them looking at her like she was some kind of living weapon. Instead, she spent her time studying the archive network more deeply. The architects had left behind more than just military technology. They had recorded art and music, philosophy and science. Helen absorbed it all, learning about a civilization that had existed when Earth was still cooling from its formation. She discovered that the architects hadn't been the first advanced race in the galaxy. Before them were others, and before those others were even more ancient civilizations. The galaxy had been full of life for billions of years, rising and falling in cycles. The architects had tried to break that cycle, to create something that would last. The Sentinels were part of that attempt. Peter helped her document these discoveries, writing reports and papers that would be studied for decades. He was amazed by how much information the archive network contained. It was like having access to a library that held the collected knowledge of a million worlds. And Helen could access all of it just by thinking. But the archive network came with a price. Helen could feel the Sentinels aging, their ancient systems slowly breaking down. They had been built to last millions of years, but even architect technology had limits. Eventually, they would fail. When that happened, the archive network would fade, and Helen would lose the connection that had become such a fundamental part of her. She didn't know if she would survive that loss. The network was so deeply integrated with her mind that separating from it might kill her. Or it might just leave her empty, a shadow of what she had become. Either way, she tried not to think about it. The Sentinels had thousands of years of life left. That was long enough to accomplish what needed to be done. New threats emerged as humanity expanded deeper into the galaxy. Most were minor pirates and raiders that could be handled by normal military forces. But sometimes the horizon and its Sentinels were needed. Helen led these missions personally, coordinating her ancient war machines with human ships to protect colonies and traders. She became famous throughout human space, though she never wanted that fame. People called her the Sentinel Speaker, the woman who could command ancient war gods. Stories about her grew more exaggerated with each telling. Some said she could see the future. Others claimed she wasn't human at all anymore, but an architect reborn. The truth was simpler and sadder. Helen was just a language professor who had activated something she didn't understand and paid the price for it. She had saved humanity but lost herself in the process. The woman who had stood in that Martian cave so long ago was gone, replaced by something that served the same purpose as the Sentinels themselves. Peter asked her once if she regretted speaking those words, activating the first Sentinel. Helen thought about it for a long time before answering. She said no, she didn't regret it. The alternative was watching the Devourers consume every human in the galaxy. But she also said that if she could go back, she would have found a way to share the burden instead of carrying it alone. One day a message arrived from deep space. It was in Sumerian, transmitted on frequencies that matched the archive network. Someone or something was trying to contact Helen specifically. The message was brief and cryptic, but its meaning was clear. Other young races were awakening, finding their own architect's gifts. They needed guidance, needed someone who understood what they were going through. Admiral Palmer approved a long-range expedition. The horizon would travel beyond explored space, following the message's source. It would take years, maybe decades. But Helen didn't mind. She had nothing tying her to human space anymore. Her purpose was wherever the Sentinels were needed. Captain Hayes assembled a crew of volunteers who understood the risks. This journey would take them farther from Earth than any humans had gone before. They might find wonders or horrors, allies or enemies, but they would have the Sentinels to protect them, and Helen to guide the ancient machines. Peter chose to come despite Helen's protests. He said someone needed to document this journey, to record what they found for future generations. More than that, he said Helen shouldn't face whatever was out there alone. She was his friend, and friends didn't abandon each other even when things got strange. Morrison sent a message before they departed. He wished them luck and told Helen to be careful. He said the galaxy needed her, but it also needed her to come back alive. She didn't promise anything. She had learned not to make promises she might not be able to keep. The Horizon departed Earth orbit on a clear day. Helen watched her homeworld shrink in the viewing screen until it was just a blue dot among billions of stars. She felt something like sadness, but it was distant and muted. The archive network filled her mind with data about their course, sensor readings from the Sentinels, calculations and projections for the journey ahead. Captain Hayes set course for the unknown regions where the message had originated. The Sentinels formed an escort around the ship, 12 ancient war machines following their speaker into the darkness. Behind them, human space continued without them, protected by the Sentinels they had left behind and the knowledge Helen had shared. The journey would be long and difficult, but Helen felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond fighting and protecting. The architects had left their gifts scattered across the galaxy, waiting for the right people to find them. She would help those people, teach them what she had learned, share the burden that had been placed on her shoulders alone. Other young races were waking up to the reality of the galaxy. They would find Sentinels or other architect technologies. They would need guidance to avoid the mistakes humanity had made, to use these gifts wisely instead of being used by them. Helen would be there to help them, to show them that the power came with a price but was worth paying. Peter stood beside her on the bridge as they jumped to faster-than-light travel. He asked what she thought they would find out there. Helen smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed in months. She said she didn't know, but that was okay. The unknown was better than the alternative, better than staying behind and slowly fading away. The architects had left their legacy across the galaxy. Helen was part of that legacy now, connected to it in ways she still didn't fully understand. She carried their language in her mind, their knowledge in her thoughts, their purpose in her actions. She wasn't just Helen Carter anymore, the language professor from Earth. She was the speaker, the bridge between humanity and the ancient race that had prepared the way. As the Horizon traveled through the darkness between stars, Helen closed her eyes and felt the archive network around her like a warm blanket. The Sentinels were there, constant and reassuring. The echoes of the architects whispered wisdom she was only beginning to comprehend. And somewhere far ahead, other voices called out, speaking dead languages and awakening ancient machines. The galaxy was vast and full of mysteries. Helen intended to explore them all, one dead language at a time. She had started this journey by speaking words that hadn't been heard in thousands of years. Now she would continue it, teaching those words to anyone who needed to hear them. The age of humanity had begun, and she would make sure other races joined them in the light. The Horizon jumped into the unknown, carrying Helen and her. The journey to Epsilon Eridani took 6 weeks. The Horizon was fast, but space was vast. Helen spent the time learning everything she could from the Sentinel. It taught her more about the architect's language, including technical terms and military commands. She needed to be fluent if she was going to wake up the other Sentinels and coordinate them in battle. Captain Linda Hayes ran a tight ship. She held daily briefings where everyone shared information and made plans. The crew included scientists, engineers, and soldiers, all of them volunteers who understood the risks. They were heading into unknown territory to activate ancient war machines based on the word of one Sentinel. If something went wrong, they were on their own. Peter worked with the science team analyzing the data the Sentinel had provided. They studied the Devourers, trying to understand how the creatures thought and fought. The enemy didn't use traditional technology. Their ships were alive, grown from biological material. They communicated through some kind of telepathic network that allowed perfect coordination between thousands of individuals. Morrison trained the security team in new tactics. The Sentinel had shared information about Devourer combat methods. The creatures were fast and deadly at close range, using claws and acid to tear through armor, but they were vulnerable to certain frequencies of energy. Human weapons could be modified to exploit this weakness. The frozen moon appeared on the viewing screen after weeks of travel. It was a small world covered in thick ice, orbiting a massive gas giant that dominated the sky. Sensors detected the buried structure exactly where the Sentinel said it would be. The crew prepared for landing while engineers readied the drilling equipment. The Horizon couldn't land on the surface because of the unstable ice. Instead, it stayed in orbit while shuttles carried the team down. Helen stood on the moon's surface in her environmental suit, staring at the endless white landscape. Somewhere beneath her feet, another Sentinel was sleeping. The drilling operation took 5 days. The ice was harder than expected, and the equipment kept breaking down. But eventually they broke through into a chamber similar to the one on Mars. Helen descended on a cable with Morrison, Peter, and a team of soldiers. Their lights revealed another artifact, larger than the first Sentinel. This one was different in design. Where the Mars Sentinel had looked almost elegant, this one was clearly built for war. Heavy armor plates covered its surface, and the symbols were fewer, more direct. Helen recognized them immediately as Sumerian, but the style was different. This Sentinel had been created later in the war when the architects had less time for beauty. Helen spoke the activation phrase with confidence this time. She knew what to expect when the ancient machine woke up. The symbols glowed and the artifact began to transform. This Sentinel was bigger, standing 40 feet tall when fully extended. Its weapons were obvious, built into its arms and shoulders. The new Sentinel identified itself as a warrior-class unit. It had been designed for assault operations, breaching enemy defenses and destroying Devourer vessels. It scanned Helen and recognized her genetic markers. She was accepted as its commander without question. The warrior Sentinel pledged itself to humanity's defense. Getting both Sentinels back to the Horizon was a challenge. The engineering team had to modify the cargo bay to fit them both. The machines could compact themselves to save space, but they were still massive. Captain Hayes made it work, reorganizing the ship's storage and equipment to make room. With 2 Sentinels active, Helen could feel something changing. The machines were connected to each other through the archive network. They shared information constantly, updating each other on status and observations. Helen was part of that network now. When she closed her eyes, she could sense both Sentinels, feel their presence like a weight in her mind. The next destination was a desert planet orbiting a red dwarf star. The journey took 8 weeks. During that time, Helen practiced coordinating both Sentinels through mental commands. She found she could give them orders without speaking, just by thinking clearly about what she wanted. The Sentinels responded instantly, their ancient programming recognizing her authority. The desert planet was hot and dry, with winds that howled across endless sand dunes. The buried Sentinel was deep underground, protected from the harsh environment. This excavation was easier because they could use heavy equipment without worrying about melting ice. They reached the chamber in 3 days. The third Sentinel was different again. It specialized in defense with powerful shields and sensor systems. When Helen activated it, the machine explained that its role was to protect worlds and fleets from attack. It could project energy barriers large enough to cover entire cities. In the war against the Devourers, these Guardian-class Sentinels had saved countless lives. The pattern continued for months. The Horizon traveled from world to world, following the coordinates provided by the archive network. Each Sentinel they woke added to their growing force. Helen discovered that she could coordinate all of them together, turning the individual machines into a unified fighting force. The architects had designed the system this way, creating a network that grew stronger with each addition. By the end of the first year, they had activated 12 Sentinels. The Horizon's cargo bay was full, and Captain Hayes had to leave some of them on different worlds to wait for pickup. Earth sent more ships to help with transportation. The Unified Defense Council was taking the Devourer threat seriously now. They had seen the Sentinels in action during training exercises, watched the ancient machines demonstrate weapons that made human technology look primitive. Helen had changed during the year of travel and activation. The constant connection to the archive network had affected her mind. She could process information faster, understand complex concepts that would have confused her before. The Sentinels were teaching her without words, sharing knowledge through their mental link. Peter noticed the changes and worried about her. He asked if she was still human or if the Sentinels were turning her into something else. Helen didn't have a good answer. She felt like herself, but also more than herself. The boundaries between her thoughts and the archive network were becoming blurred. Morrison focused on practical matters. He worked with the Sentinels to develop combat strategies and train human forces. The machines were willing teachers, sharing tactics and techniques from their ancient war. Human soldiers learned to fight alongside the Sentinels, coordinating attacks and supporting each other in simulated battles. Then the warning came. One of the Sentinels detected something at the edge of explored space. Ships were approaching, moving faster than anything human. The sensor data matched records from the Architect War. The Devourers had arrived early. Humanity's time had run out. Captain Hayes immediately changed course, heading back toward human space at maximum speed. Messages were sent to Earth and all the colonies, warning them to prepare for attack. The Unified Defense Council declared a state of emergency. Every ship that could fight was mobilized. Civilians were evacuated from the outer colonies to safer locations. Helen stood on the Horizon's bridge and watched the sensor displays. The Devourer fleet was massive, hundreds of ships spreading out as they entered human territory. They moved with purpose, heading directly for the nearest settlements. There was no attempt at communication, no warning or ultimatum. The enemy had come to consume, nothing more. The first battle would happen at Kepler Colony, a mining settlement on the frontier. Admiral George Palmer was gathering Earth's fleet there, preparing to make a stand. The Horizon would arrive with its cargo of Sentinels just in time to join the fight. Helen felt the weight of responsibility again. Everything depended on whether the Sentinels were enough to stop the Devourers. The Horizon dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler system. Immediately, the viewing screens filled with chaos. Hundreds of ships fought desperately against the Devourer fleet. Human vessels fired missiles and energy weapons, but the enemy seemed barely affected. The biological ships absorbed damage and kept coming, responding with weapons that tore through armor and shields. Admiral Palmer's flagship, the Defender, was at the center of the formation. The Admiral was an old military man who had fought in the colony wars decades ago. He understood tactics and strategy better than anyone in the fleet, but this enemy was unlike anything humanity had faced before. Traditional weapons weren't working. Captain Hayes brought the Horizon into formation with the human fleet. The cargo bay doors opened and the Sentinels deployed into space. They moved with grace despite their size, flowing out of the ship like dancers. Helen coordinated them through the archive network, positioning each Sentinel where it would be most effective. The first Sentinel, the one from Mars, engaged a group of Devourer ships. Its plasma weapons fired with devastating effect. The enemy vessels tried to dodge, but the Sentinel predicted their movements. 3 Devourer ships exploded in rapid succession. The remaining enemies turned to focus on this new threat. Helen felt everything through the archive network. She experienced the battle from multiple perspectives at once, seeing through the sensors of all 12 Sentinels. It was overwhelming at first, too much information coming too fast. But her mind adapted, sorting and processing the data with inhuman efficiency. The warrior-class Sentinels pushed forward, breaking through the Devourer formation. Their heavy weapons carved paths through the enemy fleet. Behind them, human ships followed, taking advantage of the openings. Admiral Palmer saw the opportunity and ordered his forces to concentrate their fire where the Sentinels had weakened the enemy. The Guardian Sentinels projected shields around damaged human vessels, giving them time to retreat and repair. Medical ships moved forward under protection, rescuing survivors from destroyed ships. The tide of battle was shifting. For the first time, humanity was fighting the Devourers on equal terms. But then the enemy revealed their true strength. A massive ship emerged from deeper in the system, dwarfing everything else on the battlefield. It was the size of a small moon, covered in organic armor and bristling with weapons. The Sentinel database identified it as a Hive Mother, a command vessel that controlled thousands of Devourer warriors. The Hive Mother fired its main weapon, a beam of energy that cut through space like a blade. It struck one of the Guardian Sentinels, overloading its shields and damaging its core systems. The Sentinel fell silent, its connection to the archive network severed. Helen felt the loss like a physical blow. For the first time, one of her Sentinels had been destroyed. Morrison shouted at her to fall back, but Helen refused. She could feel something through the archive network, a pattern in how the Devourers fought. They weren't individuals making their own decisions. They were all connected to the Hive Mother through a telepathic link. That was their strength, but it was also a weakness. Helen dove deeper into the archive network, searching for information about the Devourer hive mind. The Sentinels had records from the ancient war, studies the architects had made. They had learned that disrupting the connection between Devourers and their command ships caused confusion and disarray. Hurt the hive mother and the whole fleet would suffer. She formulated a plan and shared it with Admiral Palmer through the communication system. The Admiral understood immediately. It was risky, but they didn't have many options. He ordered all ships to focus their fire on the hive mother's weapons while the Sentinels went for the core. The remaining 11 Sentinels grouped together and charged the massive enemy vessel. Devourer ships tried to intercept them, but the Sentinels were too fast and too well coordinated. They reached the hive mother and began targeting specific points on its hull, places where the archive network indicated the central nervous system was located. Helen guided their attacks, using her connection to see through their sensors. She found the weak points and directed plasma fire with surgical precision. The hive mother fought back, its biological weapons releasing swarms of smaller creatures. But the Guardian Sentinels shielded their companions, allowing the assault to continue. Inside the horizon, Peter watched the battle with growing fear. Helen stood motionless on the bridge, her eyes closed and her hands clenched into fists. She was completely immersed in the archive network. Her consciousness spread across 12 ancient war machines. He worried that she might lose herself entirely in the connection. The Sentinels concentrated their fire on a single point, exactly as the archive data suggested. The hive mother's armor cracked and then shattered. Plasma beams penetrated deep into the creature's core. The massive ship shuddered and began to break apart from the inside. Its telepathic scream echoed through space, felt by every devourer in the system. The enemy fleet lost coordination immediately. Ships collided with each other or drifted aimlessly. Some turned on their own allies, confusion overwhelming their simple minds. Admiral Palmer's forces pressed the advantage, destroying the helpless devourers with overwhelming firepower. Helen opened her eyes as the battle ended. The Kepler system was saved, but the cost had been high. Dozens of human ships were destroyed and thousands of people dead. One Sentinel was gone, its ancient consciousness erased forever. The victory felt hollow. Captain Hayes put a hand on Helen's shoulder. The woman looked exhausted, drained by the effort of coordinating the Sentinels, but there was something else in her expression. Something that worried Hayes. Helen's eyes seemed distant, as if she was only partly present in her own body. The archive network was changing her in ways they didn't fully understand. Morrison reported that the Devourer retreat was complete. The surviving enemy ships had fled the system, heading back toward deep space. But they would return. The Devourers never gave up once they found prey. This battle was just the beginning of a longer war. Admiral Palmer contacted the Horizon to personally thank Helen and her team. He had been skeptical about the Sentinels at first, but he was convinced now. Without them, the battle would have been lost and Kepler Colony destroyed. He requested that Helen and the Sentinels join his fleet permanently as a special operations unit. Helen agreed, though she knew it meant spending the rest of her life at war. The quiet days of studying ancient languages were gone forever. She was a military commander now, responsible for weapons of incredible power. The Sentinels obeyed her without question, and that authority came with a burden she could never set down. The fleet regrouped and began rescue operations. Survivors were pulled from damaged ships and wounded were treated in medical bays. Engineers worked to repair vessels that could be salvaged. The Sentinels helped with the recovery, using their strength to move wreckage and their sensors to locate survivors in the debris. Peter finally got Helen alone in her quarters. He asked her directly if she was okay. Helen took a long time to answer. She explained that the archive network was inside her mind all the time now. She could hear the Sentinels constantly, feel their thoughts and observations. It was like having 12 voices in her head all talking at once. Peter suggested she disconnect from the network, take a break from commanding the Sentinels. But Helen shook her head. If she let go now, humanity would lose its only real advantage against the Devourers. She had to stay connected, had to keep fighting. There was no one else who could do this job. The Devourers returned 3 months later with a larger fleet. This time they attacked multiple colonies simultaneously, forcing humanity to divide its forces. Admiral Palmer split his fleet into battle groups, each one supported by Sentinels. Helen had to coordinate attacks across different star systems, stretching her mental abilities to their limits. The war became Helen's entire existence. She moved from battle to battle, sleeping only when her body refused to stay awake. The archive network fed her information constantly, tactical data and sensor readings from hundreds of sources. She learned to process it all, turning the chaos of war into clear decisions and orders. More sentinels were activated as the Horizon continued its search between battles. The network grew to 20 machines, then 30. Each new sentinel made the network stronger, gave Helen more resources to coordinate. But it also made the mental burden heavier. She was connected to an army of ancient war machines, and they all looked to her for guidance. Morrison watched her deteriorate with growing concern. Helen rarely spoke anymore unless giving orders. She ate only when reminded and sometimes seemed to forget that other people were in the room with her. The human part of her was fading, replaced by something colder and more efficient. Peter tried to help by researching the architects. He studied the records in the archive network, looking for information about how the ancient race had handled their own war. He discovered that the architects had faced the same problem. Their military leaders became so connected to their technology that they lost touch with normal life. Captain Hayes reported these concerns to Admiral Palmer. The Admiral understood the problem but couldn't see a solution. Helen was winning the war. Under her command, the Sentinels had defeated every Devourer attack. Human casualties were falling and more colonies were being saved. Whatever was happening to her mind, it was working. But Peter refused to give up on his friend. He spent hours in the archive network himself, searching for answers. The architects had left behind more than just weapons and tactical data. They had recorded their history, their philosophy, their regrets. Deep in the database, Peter found references to something called the Final Archive. The Final Archive was described as a repository of ultimate knowledge, the architects' greatest achievement and their final gift to younger races. It contained information about the Devourer's true nature and potentially a way to end the war permanently. But the location was encoded in a puzzle that required perfect understanding of the architect's language and culture. Peter brought this discovery to Helen during a brief moment between battles. She was interested but distracted, her mind still partially engaged with the Sentinels. He insisted that she focus, that this could be important. Together, they began working on the puzzle, translating complex passages of ancient Sumerian and cross-referencing them with architect philosophy. The work gave Helen something to think about besides war and death. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. The puzzle was challenging, requiring her to think like an architect and understand their way of seeing the universe. She realized how much she had missed this kind of intellectual challenge. It took 3 weeks of intense study, but they finally solved the puzzle. The Final Archive wasn't hidden on some distant world. It was orbiting Earth's sun, concealed within the corona itself. The architects had placed their greatest treasure where only someone from Earth could reach it, protected by the same star that had nurtured human civilization. Admiral Palmer authorized an immediate mission. The Defender would escort the Horizon to Sol system, accompanied by all available Sentinels. This could be the key to ending the war, and they couldn't afford to wait. The Devourers were massing their forces for a final assault on Earth itself. Time was running out. The journey back to humanity's home system felt strange to Helen. She had been gone for over 2 years, traveling from world to world while activating Sentinels and fighting battles. Earth had continued without her, people living their normal lives while she fought to protect them. Part of her resented them for that normalcy, though she knew it was unfair. The fleet arrived at Sol system to find it heavily fortified. Every defense station was active, and hundreds of ships patrolled the space around Earth. The Unified Defense Council had prepared for the worst, ready to defend humanity's birthplace with everything they had. Admiral Palmer coordinated with the defensive forces while the Horizon prepared for its dive into the sun. Captain Hayes plotted a course into the corona using calculations from the archive network. The Sentinels had data about the sun's structure and where the safe paths were located. It would still be dangerous, pushing the ship's shields to their limits. But there was no other way to reach the Final Archive. Helen stood on the bridge as they descended into the sun's atmosphere. The viewing screens had to be heavily filtered to prevent blindness from the intense light. Heat alarms sounded throughout the ship as external temperatures climbed into the millions of degrees. The shields held, but barely. Peter was beside her, monitoring the sensor readings and looking for the archive. The Sentinels had gone dormant to conserve power, their shields protecting them from the heat. Helen felt their presence in her mind like sleeping giants waiting to wake when needed. The archive appeared on sensors as they pushed deeper into the corona. It was a crystalline structure, impossible and beautiful, floating in a pocket of stable space. The architects had created this sanctuary using technology beyond human understanding, a place where matter could exist undistorted by the sun's fury. Captain Hayes brought the horizon alongside the archive. An airlock extended from the ship, connecting to an entrance in the crystal. Helen and Peter suited up in heavy protective gear, though they both knew the suits would be useless if anything went wrong. Morrison insisted on coming with them despite their protests. They entered the archive together, walking through corridors of crystal that pulsed with inner light. The place felt alive, though not in any biological sense. It was more like the archive itself was conscious, aware of their presence and purpose. Helen felt it reaching out to her through the archive network, recognizing her authority. The central chamber contained a massive crystal, larger than the horizon itself. Information flowed through it like water, visible as streams of light. Helen approached and placed her hand on the surface. Immediately, knowledge flooded her mind. She saw the truth about the architects, about the devourers, about everything the ancient race had learned during their war. The architects hadn't been defeated. They had made a choice. Rather than continue fighting forever, they had transcended their physical forms and moved beyond the material universe. But they left behind everything they had learned, encoded in archives like this one. The Sentinels, the language gifts, all of it was meant to help younger races survive what the architects could not defeat. The weapon wasn't a device or a bomb. It was information, a specific pattern of thoughts and frequencies that could rewrite the devourer hive mind. The creatures weren't evil or malicious. They were broken, damaged by something that happened billions of years ago. The architects had learned how to fix them, to restore what the devourers had lost and make them whole again. But using the weapon required a human mind to generate the pattern. The information had to be processed through someone who understood the architect's language and philosophy. Someone who was connected to the Sentinel network and could broadcast the signal across the galaxy. Someone like Helen. Peter saw what she was thinking and immediately protested. The archive's data indicated that broadcasting the signal would be devastating to a human mind. Helen might not survive the process, and even if she did, she would be changed forever. He begged her to find another way, to let someone else take the risk. But Helen had already made her decision. She had been preparing for this moment since she first activated the Sentinel on Mars. The archive network had been changing her for a reason, giving her the mental capacity to handle the weapon. She was the only one who could do this, and she had accepted that burden long ago. Morrison tried to physically stop her, but Helen was already connecting to the archive's main crystal. The weapon's pattern flooded into her mind. Information so vast and complex that it would have killed a normal person instantly. But Helen wasn't normal anymore. The archive network had transformed her into something that could bridge the gap between human and architect. She began the broadcast, channeling the weapon through the archive network and out to every sentinel in the galaxy. The machines acted as amplifiers, spreading the signal across light years in moments. The pattern reached the devourers wherever they were, touching every mind in their vast hive network. The effect was immediate and total. Devourer ships across the galaxy stopped moving. The rage and hunger that had driven them for eons simply vanished. They remembered what they had been before, when they were whole and sane. The weapon didn't kill them. It healed them, restored what had been broken so long ago that even they had forgotten. Peter and Morrison watched in horror as Helen collapsed. Her body convulsed, unable to handle the strain of channeling so much information. They pulled her away from the crystal and called for medical help. Captain Hayes brought the Horizon's doctor down to the archive.